The neighborhood chat started exploding around 9:14 p.m. Then, Mark sent a message that suddenly made everyone stop joking. Wait, if they disable our gate passes, how are we supposed to get home? For a few seconds, nobody answered. The chat had been treating the whole thing like another ridiculous HOA email, the kind people skimmed while watching television, the kind people complained about and forgot 10 minutes later. Then, residents started opening the email again, and this time, they actually read it. The subject line sounded harmless enough: Community Access Enforcement Update. Nobody expected that phrase to become the only thing the neighborhood would talk about for the rest of the week. At first, the rules sounded like standard HOA punishment: late dues, unpaid balances, governing document violations. Nothing unusual. Then, people reached the list. No clubhouse access, no pool access, no landscaping services, no trash pickup. The reactions were immediate. A few residents laughed, somebody replied with a GIF. Another neighbor joked that the board was trying to invent new ways to make everyone hate them. For a moment, it looked like the conversation was already dying. Then, somebody noticed another line: gate transponders disabled. The chat went quiet. Because this wasn't an ordinary subdivision. The entire neighborhood sat behind a gated entrance. Every resident used a transponder. Drive up, the scanner recognized the vehicle, the barrier lifted, you went home. Nobody thought about it. Until now. A resident named Eric replied a few seconds later. So, what happens if somebody gets home after work and their transponder doesn't work? Another resident answered, "They probably make you talk to security." A third resident responded almost immediately. And what if security refuses? Nobody answered that one. The silence lasted longer than any message that night. Because for the first time, residents were no longer arguing about dues. They were thinking about access, about the gate, about the possibility that a homeowners association might decide who could move freely through the neighborhood and who couldn't. And then somebody reached the final line. Mail will be returned to USPS. Everything changed. The chat exploded again. People started quoting laws, posting screenshots, copying links, arguing about mailboxes, arguing about federal crimes, arguing about whether the board had lost its mind. One resident claimed interfering with mail could bring in postal inspectors. Another posted a phone number. A third asked how the HOA planned to return mail in the first place. The questions came faster than anyone could answer them. Because suddenly, this no longer sounded like an HOA policy update. It sounded like a board of directors that believed it could control access to the neighborhood, access to services, and maybe even access to the mail itself. Outside, the entrance gate stood exactly where it always had. Palm trees swayed under the Florida night air. The security booth lights glowed beside the road. Cars came and went. The neighborhood looked completely normal. But inside the community chat, residents were beginning to realize something unsettling. The issue was never the unpaid dues. The issue was what the board seemed willing to do about them. And before the night was over, people would start asking a much bigger question. Not whether the HOA could enforce these rules, but whether any of them were legal at all. The neighborhood chat did not calm down after Mark's message. It got worse, because once people started thinking about the gate, they couldn't stop. Do they mean future violations? What if somebody is already behind on dues? Can they actually deactivate a transponder? Then a new message appeared. I'm at the entrance right now. The chat stopped. The message came from Eric. A minute later, another notification appeared. I asked the guard about the email. People immediately started replying. What did he say? Is it real? Did they actually approve this? The typing bubble appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, Eric answered. He said, they've already been briefed. That one sentence changed the entire mood of the conversation. Until that moment, many residents still believed the email was a mistake, a draft, a misunderstanding, something written by management that would quietly disappear by morning. But security had already been briefed. That meant somebody expected questions. Somebody expected resistance. Somebody had already prepared the gate staff for angry homeowners. Linda, a retired teacher who rarely spoke in the chat, wrote the first message that made the conversation feel serious. This isn't about dues anymore. Someone asked what she meant. Linda replied, it's about access. Nobody joked after that. Eric sent another update. I asked what happens if a resident's transponder is disabled. Mark replied immediately. And? Eric answered. He said residents would have to use the security lane. That should have made everyone feel better. Instead, it made things worse. Because the security lane wasn't a backup system. It was a person, a guard, a booth, a list of names, and apparently a set of instructions from the HOA. Someone asked the obvious question, what if the guard says no? Eric replied he wouldn't answer that. The chat exploded again, because now people weren't arguing about a windshield transponder. They were talking about permission. A resident named Patricia jumped in. So if my husband gets home at 1 a.m., he's supposed to ask permission to enter the neighborhood he pays to live in? Nobody had an answer. Another resident replied, that's probably not what they mean. Patricia answered almost immediately. Then what exactly do they mean? Nobody could explain it. Mark copied the line directly from the email. All account access will be restricted and transponders disabled. The wording suddenly felt different, colder, more deliberate. Not property access, not home access, account access. Like the HOA had found a way to make something frightening sound administrative. Eric was still standing near the entrance when another message appeared. Ask if the policy already started. A minute later, he responded. He said, it's active. The chat went quiet. Then someone asked, active since when? Eric copied the exact wording. Effective yesterday. That detail hit harder than anyone expected. Yesterday. Not next week, not next month, yesterday. Which meant the policy already existed. Somebody could already be affected. Somebody could already be on a list. Nobody knew who. Nobody knew how enforcement worked. Nobody knew what instructions security had received. And because nobody knew, everyone started imagining the worst version. Then Eric posted another message. Hold on. The chat froze. No explanation, no follow-up, just those two words. 30 seconds passed, then a minute, then another. Finally, a new message appeared. A resident just pulled into the gate. People immediately started asking questions. What happened? Did it open? Was their pass disabled? Eric didn't answer right away. The typing bubble appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, he replied. Transponder didn't work. The chat absolutely exploded. Messages started flying so fast they were impossible to read. What? No way. Already? Are you serious? Mark wrote, you're kidding. Eric responded, I thought so too. Another 30 seconds passed, then another message. False alarm. The resident had rolled down the window. The guard recognized them. Apparently, the transponder battery had failed. Nothing to do with the HOA, nothing to do with enforcement, nothing to do with the email. But the damage was already done. Because for 1 full minute, dozens of residents believed they had just watched the new policy happen in real time. And that changed everything. The fear was no longer theoretical. People could suddenly picture it, pulling up to the scanner, waiting for the gate. Nothing. No beep, no movement, just a barrier arm and a security booth. A resident named Sean asked a different question. What happens during an emergency?
Nobody answered. So he asked again, what if somebody needs access immediately? Another resident said emergency services probably had their own access code. Someone else said they probably had a master key. A third person asked if anyone actually knew that for sure. Nobody did. And that uncertainty started spreading through the chat. Because the gate wasn't just another HOA amenity. It wasn't a pool, it wasn't a clubhouse. The gate was infrastructure. Every homeowner depended on it. Even the residents who paid every bill on time were suddenly paying attention. Because today's enforcement target might be unpaid dues. Tomorrow, it could be something else. Patricia posted another message. Or a mistake. That word hit people hard. Mistake. Everyone who had lived in an HOA long enough had seen mistakes. Wrong addresses, wrong violation notices, old balances, processing errors. Now, residents were imagining something much worse. A transponder disabled by mistake. A homeowner flagged by mistake. A guard following instructions by mistake.
A resident sitting outside the entrance, trying to convince security that they belonged there. Eric sent one final update from the gate. The guard said he can't discuss board enforcement details. That sounded rehearsed. And because it sounded rehearsed, it made everything worse. Mark responded immediately. So security knows enough to enforce it, but not enough to explain it? Nobody answered. Because that was exactly what seemed to be happening. The board had created a policy. Security had been briefed. Residents had been warned. And nobody had been given a clear explanation of what would actually happen if the system decided they were restricted. For almost 10 minutes, the conversation stayed focused on the gate. Then a new message appeared. This one came from Dana. Everyone keeps talking about the transponders. A few seconds later, she posted another message.
Has anyone actually read the mail part? The chat slowed. People scrolled back up. Back to the email, back to the list, back to the line most residents had ignored. Mail will be returned to USPS. At first, the gate had seemed like the biggest problem. Now, residents were beginning to realize the email contained something much worse. Because the gate belonged to the community. The clubhouse belonged to the community. But the mail didn't. And once people started reading that section, the conversation stopped being about HOA rules. It started becoming about federal law.
Nobody left the chat. That was the first thing Mark noticed. Normally, neighborhood arguments burn themselves out. A few complaints, a few jokes, somebody blamed the HOA, somebody defended the HOA, and then everyone went to bed. Not tonight. Tonight, people kept reopening the email, and every time they reopened it, the situation seemed worse. Around 10 o'clock, Patricia sent a message. Wait. The chat immediately woke back up. A few seconds later, she posted another message. This doesn't just apply to unpaid dues. Mark responded first. What do you mean? Patricia copied a line directly from the email. Late dues or governing document violations. The word violations changed everything. Because unpaid dues felt specific.
violations felt limitless. Everybody in the neighborhood had received a violation notice at some point. Everybody. Wrong trash can placement, holiday decorations, parking, landscaping, mailbox appearance, something. The HOA always seemed to find something. Trevor jumped into the conversation. I got one last year because they thought my fence color was wrong. Several laughing reactions appeared. Then Trevor added another message. It wasn't even my fence. The laughing reactions stopped because nobody was actually laughing. Everyone understood the point. Mistakes happened. Administrative mistakes happened all the time. Linda finally wrote, "So technically, this applies to almost everyone." Nobody disagreed. The realization spread through the chat almost immediately. Residents had spent the entire evening imagining people who refused to pay their dues. Now, they were imagining themselves. A warning letter, a misunderstanding, a disagreement with the board, an account error. Suddenly, the email felt much closer, much more personal. Patricia kept reading. No clubhouse access. That barely caused a reaction. One resident replied, "They can keep the clubhouse." A few laughing emojis appeared. Then Patricia continued, "No pool access." Parents immediately started complaining. One resident wrote, "My kids are going to love being punished for something they don't even understand." Another replied, "Assuming the violation is even real." Nobody answered, because the conversation had drifted back to the same problem. Mistakes. Everybody trusted the rules when they were applied correctly. Nobody trusted them to be applied perfectly. Then Dana posted, "Keep reading." Patricia did. No landscaping.
The chat slowed. Not because people were shocked, because they were confused. Mark finally asked, "How exactly does that even work?" Nobody knew. The landscaping company maintained entire sections of the neighborhood, not individual houses. A resident joked, "What are they going to do, mow half my lawn?" A few people laughed. Then another resident replied, "I honestly don't think they've thought that far ahead." The laughter disappeared because that answer felt possible. Too possible. Every rule seemed to create a new question. Then Patricia reached the next line. No trash pickup. The reaction was immediate, much stronger than landscaping. Susan replied within seconds, "Absolutely not." Another resident answered, "It's Florida." That was enough. Nobody needed further explanation. Heat, humidity, animals, storm season, overflowing garbage. Everybody understood. Then something unexpected happened. A resident named Kevin posted a photo. No caption, just a photo. Several trash bins, overflowing behind a house. The picture had been taken after a hurricane cleanup months earlier. People immediately understood why he posted it. The image spread through the chat. The reactions followed. One resident wrote, "Imagine that sitting there for 2 weeks." Another answered, "Imagine an entire street." The conversation became more serious because trash wasn't an inconvenience. It was a problem everybody could see. Mark finally wrote, "This doesn't feel like collections." Several people reacted immediately because he was right. The email didn't read like a collections policy. It read like a punishment system. The clubhouse, the pool, the landscaping, the trash, the gate. Every rule seemed designed to make normal life harder. The longer residents discussed it, the less they talked about money, and the more they talked about power. Then Dana posted another message. "You're all skipping the last line.
The chat slowed. Patricia scrolled back down. For a few seconds, she didn't say anything. Then, she sent a single word. "Oh." Mark immediately replied, "What?" Another few seconds passed. Then, Patricia copied the final sentence. "Mail will be returned to USPS." The chat stopped. Completely. No reactions, no jokes, no arguments. Just silence. Because unlike the gate, nobody could even picture how this was supposed to work. A resident named Greg finally replied, "How?" Nobody answered. Another resident asked, "How do they return mail?" No answer. A third resident wrote, "Did they take it out of the mailbox?" Still, no answer. Then Dana posted something that made the silence worse. "I just checked." People immediately asked what she meant. Dana answered, "The mailbox cluster behind my street." The chat exploded again. "What about it?" Dana replied. "The HOA has access to the area around it." Nobody liked that answer. Not because it proved anything, because it made people imagine things. A resident asked, "Do they have mailbox keys?" Another replied, "They better not." Then Greg posted, "My mailbox cluster is behind the clubhouse." That message triggered another wave of questions, because now residents weren't imagining some abstract policy. They were imagining actual mailbox locations, actual locks, actual mail, actual people. The conversation changed completely. The gate was scary. The gate threatened access. But the mail felt different. The mail felt untouchable. A few minutes later, Patricia posted another message. "I don't think they're allowed to touch anybody's mail." For the first time all night, nobody disagreed. Nobody defended the board. Nobody argued. Everybody was staring at the same sentence. "Mail will be returned to USPS." Mark reread the email again. Then again. The words looked even stranger now. Not aggressive, not strict. Strange. Like whoever wrote them never stopped to think about what they actually meant. A few seconds later, Dana posted one final message. "If they touch anybody's mail." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to, because everyone in the chat had already reached the same conclusion. The issue was no longer whether the HOA wanted to enforce the policy. The issue was whether the HOA had just wandered into territory that didn't belong to them. And within the next hour, residents would stop asking questions about HOA rules. They would start asking questions about federal law. For most of the evening, the neighborhood had been arguing about the gate. By 11 o'clock, nobody was talking about the gate anymore. The conversation had shifted completely. Now, everyone was staring at the same line. "Mail will be returned to USPS." The sentence kept appearing in the chat, copied, reposted, highlighted, reread. Every time someone looked at it, it seemed stranger. Because unlike the other rules, nobody could explain how it was supposed to work. The clubhouse belonged to the HOA. The pool belonged to the HOA. The landscaping contracts belonged to the HOA. Even the gate belonged to the HOA. But the mail didn't. A resident named Greg asked the same question for the third time. How would they even do it? Nobody answered. Not because people disagreed, because nobody knew. A few minutes later, Michael posted a short message. "I don't think they're allowed to do that." The chat immediately came back to life. "Why? What do you mean?"
Michael answered. Because it's mail. That explanation somehow made the situation feel worse, not better, because it sounded obvious. And if it was obvious, why had the board written it into the email? Patricia replied, so what happens if they actually try? Nobody answered immediately. Then Greg wrote, I think that's federal. The chat exploded. What does that mean? Federal what? Federal law? Greg responded, I mean, this doesn't sound like HOA stuff anymore. That sentence changed the mood of the conversation, because for hours, residents had been asking one question. Can the HOA do this? Now a different question was appearing. What happens if they try? The distinction felt important, very important. Then Patricia suddenly posted another message. I just checked my mailbox. The chat immediately reacted. Why? Patricia answered, because this email is making me paranoid. Several laughing reactions appeared, then disappeared, because everybody understood. A few seconds later, Patricia sent another message. One of the mailbox doors was open. The chat exploded. What? Seriously? Was something missing? Patricia didn't answer right away. The typing bubble appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, she replied, wrong box. The entire chat seemed to exhale at once. False alarm. Nothing was missing. Nothing had happened. But for nearly a minute, dozens of residents thought they were watching the first real consequence of the policy. And that realization was unsettling. Because the HOA hadn't touched anyone's mail. Not yet. Yet people were already checking their mailboxes at 11 o'clock at night. The email had changed behavior. That alone was disturbing. Then, another resident admitted something. I checked mine too. A few seconds later, same. Then, so did I. The messages kept appearing. Residents all over the neighborhood were walking outside and checking their mail. Not because something had happened, because they were afraid something might. Mark stared at the chat. The panic was spreading. Not dramatically, quietly, which somehow felt worse. Nobody was screaming. Nobody was threatening lawsuits. People were simply becoming suspicious of something they had never questioned before. Their own mailbox. Then, Dana posted another message. I have a question. The chat slowed. What? Dana replied. Who actually has access to the mailbox area? Nobody answered immediately, because that question felt dangerous. The mailboxes were located throughout the neighborhood. Some were near common areas, some were near sidewalks, some sat beside HOA-maintained property. Residents had walked past them for years without thinking about it. Now, they were thinking about them constantly. A resident named Kevin finally replied, My mailbox cluster is behind the clubhouse. Several people reacted immediately. Another resident wrote, So was mine. Then another and another. The conversation shifted again. People were no longer discussing policy. They were discussing physical locations, locks, doors, keys, actual pieces of mail, actual mailboxes, actual access. The issue suddenly felt real, much more real. Then, Greg posted another message. If they touch anybody's mail, this is gonna get ugly. Nobody disagreed. For the first time all evening, there was almost complete consensus. The gate had divided people, the
pool had divided people. Even the landscaping and trash pickup had produced arguments. The mail didn't. Everybody seemed uncomfortable. Everybody. Then somebody posted a screenshot. No explanation, just a screenshot. At the top were 3 words: Postal Inspection Service. The chat immediately filled with questions. What is that? Who are they? The resident answered. They investigate mail crimes. The phrase sounded absurd. Mail crimes? Not HOA violations, not covenant enforcement, not collections. Mail crimes. Patricia replied almost immediately. That can't be real.
Another resident responded, "It is." The chat became quieter after that. Not calmer, quieter. Because people were reading, searching, looking things up. The conversation no longer felt like a neighborhood argument. It felt like a neighborhood trying to understand a mistake. A very big mistake. Then, Dana posted another message. "I just signed up for informed delivery." Several residents asked what that was. Dana explained. USPS would send notifications showing mail scheduled for delivery. The chat immediately became interested. Why would you do that? Dana's answer changed the atmosphere again. Because if something disappears? A few seconds passed. Then she finished the sentence. "I want proof it arrived." Nobody replied. Because everybody understood. The conversation wasn't about mail anymore. It was about evidence. That realization lingered in the chat. Residents were checking mailboxes, receiving screenshots,
reading government websites, signing up for delivery notifications. And nobody had touched a single piece of mail. Not yet. All of this panic had been created by a threat, not an action, a threat. The HOA hadn't returned any mail. The HOA hadn't opened any mailboxes. The HOA had simply announced that it intended to. And the neighborhood was already preparing. For most of the night, residents had been worried about getting through the gate. By midnight, nobody was talking about the gate anymore. Now, they were talking about evidence. Because for the first time, people weren't preparing for an HOA dispute. They were preparing for something they couldn't quite name yet. And all of it started with a single sentence. Mail will be returned to USPS.
The next morning, the neighborhood chat was already active before most people left for work. Nobody was talking about the pool anymore. Nobody cared about landscaping. Nobody mentioned trash pickup. The conversation had narrowed to 2 things: the gate and the mail. Mark opened the chat while drinking coffee. There were already dozens of unread messages. Most looked exactly like the messages from the night before. Questions, theories, screenshots. Nobody seemed any closer to an answer. Then, Patricia posted a message. The chat immediately slowed. Patricia rarely posted unless she thought something mattered. The message contained only 5 words. "Guys, I think we have something." The reaction started instantly. "What? What happened? Did somebody call USPS?" Patricia answered, "No." Then another message appeared. "I found a Florida attorney." The chat exploded. Actual attorney or Reddit attorney? Those aren't always the same thing. A few laughing reactions appeared. Patricia replied almost immediately.
actual Florida attorney. The laughter disappeared. For the first time since the email arrived, residents felt like they might finally get an answer. Not another theory, an answer. Patricia started posting sections of the comment, not the whole thing, just the parts she thought mattered. The first section disappointed everyone. Florida law allows HOAs to suspend certain amenities for unpaid obligations. Several residents reacted immediately. There it is. That's what the board keeps saying. Told ya. For a moment, the HOA seemed right. The mood shifted. Not panic, not fear. Disappointment. Then, Patricia posted another section. Common areas, common facilities, association property. The chat slowed again. People started reading more carefully. The attorney wasn't talking about houses. He wasn't talking about driveways. He wasn't talking about access. He was talking about amenities. The distinction seemed small at first. Then, Patricia posted another screenshot. This one was highlighted. Several residents immediately asked why. Patricia replied with 2 words: keep reading. The chat became quiet. Then she pasted the next sentence. This subsection does not apply to areas needed to access the property. Nobody responded. 10 seconds passed. 20. 30. The chat had never been that quiet. Then Mark finally wrote, "Wait." A few seconds later, another message appeared. "Read that again." Patricia did.
This subsection does not apply to areas needed to access the property. This time, everybody understood. The gate, the entrance lane, the security checkpoint. The entire conversation from the previous night came rushing back. One resident replied first, "That's the gate." Another followed, "That's absolutely the gate." Then another, "They literally described the gate." The chat exploded. Because for the first time since the email arrived, residents weren't dealing with guesses. They were reading an opinion from somebody who actually understood the law. Patricia kept scrolling. The attorney's comment became more direct. The HOA could suspend amenities, but access to the property itself was different. That sentence spread through the chat almost instantly. Copied, quoted, reposted, highlighted. Residents who hadn't participated in hours suddenly returned. Because the issue had never really been the pool, or the clubhouse, or the landscaping. The thing that scared everyone from the beginning was the possibility of being stopped before they reached their own home. Mark reread the attorney's words, then reread them again. Something about them bothered him. Not because they were confusing, because they were clear, very clear. And that created a new question. If this attorney understood the distinction immediately, why didn't the board? The question appeared in the chat a few minutes later. Nobody knew who typed it first, but once it appeared, residents couldn't stop talking about it. Maybe the board didn't know. Maybe management wrote the email. Maybe somebody copied language from another policy. Maybe nobody checked it. All of those explanations were possible. Then, Patricia posted another section of the comment. This time, the reaction was completely different. The attorney wasn't discussing statutes anymore. He was discussing the people running the HOA. Patricia copied the line exactly. Your HOA appears to be run by morons. The chat exploded. For the first time in nearly 24 hours, people genuinely laughed. Not nervous laughter, not sarcastic laughter, actual laughter. Screenshots started circulating immediately. Residents began quoting the sentence back and forth. One person changed their chat nickname to Moron Number 7.
Another replied with nothing but laughing emojis. Even Mark laughed, because after hours of fear, confusion, and speculation, the bluntness felt refreshing. The attorney wasn't trying to sound diplomatic. He wasn't trying to sound polite. He was saying exactly what many residents had been thinking. Then Patricia posted one final section. The mood changed again. The attorney explained what he would do if he represented a homeowner. Send a warning letter, give the board a chance to fix the policy, give them a chance to reverse course, then challenge it if necessary. The chat became quieter, not because people were bored, because the conversation was no longer theoretical. Now residents were talking about consequences, legal fees, court filings, public records, embarrassing questions, the kind of problems HOA boards hated. Mark stared at the screen. The fear that had dominated the previous night was fading. Not completely, but enough. Something new was replacing it. The board wasn't the only group with options. The board wasn't the final word. That realization spread through the neighborhood faster than any legal explanation, because residents had spent almost an entire day assuming the email represented power. Now, they were beginning to see something else. Risk. Then, Greg posted a message. The chat immediately noticed, because Greg rarely interrupted a conversation unless he thought he had something worth saying. His message contained only one sentence. If a Florida attorney spotted the problem in 5 minutes, a few seconds passed. Then he posted the rest. How did the board miss it? Nobody answered, because there were only two possibilities.
Either the board never understood the policy they approved, or they did, and neither possibility made anyone feel better. For the first time since the email arrived, residents weren't asking whether the policy was aggressive. They weren't asking whether it was fair. They weren't even asking whether it would work. They were asking something much more uncomfortable. How had this policy survived long enough to become an email? And somewhere inside that question was a possibility far more dangerous to the HOA than angry homeowners. The possibility that the board had created a problem it couldn't defend. For about an hour, the neighborhood felt different. Not calmer, just lighter. The attorney's comment had done something nobody expected. It had given people an explanation, a line, a limit. For the first time since the email arrived, residents felt like the board might actually be wrong. Not unpopular, not aggressive. Wrong. The distinction mattered a lot. People were sharing screenshots, highlighting sections, forwarding the attorney's comment to neighbors who hadn't seen it yet. The mood had shifted from panic to confidence. Slowly, carefully, but it had shifted. Then Dana posted a message. I emailed management. The chat immediately woke up. What did you send? The attorney comment? Dana replied, yes. A few seconds later, another resident jumped in. So did I. Then another, and me. Mark wasn't surprised. The entire neighborhood had spent nearly a day discussing the policy. Of course people were contacting management. Of course they were sending screenshots. The attorney's comment felt like evidence, something concrete, something the board couldn't ignore. At least, that was what people assumed. Around lunchtime, Dana posted again. The chat immediately reacted. What did they say? Dana's response was short. They haven't responded. Oh, the disappointment was immediate. Not devastating, just frustrating. Residents had expected pushback. They hadn't expected silence. Then, another resident named Kevin posted. I got a response. The chat exploded. What did they say? Post it. Seriously? Kevin uploaded a screenshot. The response was short.
professional, carefully written, and somehow that made it worse. The message thanked him for his concerns, acknowledged receipt of the email, then ended with a single sentence. The policy remains in effect. The chat stopped. Nobody responded. 5 seconds. 10. Then Patricia wrote, "Wait." Another message appeared. "They've seen the attorney comment?" Kevin replied, "Yes." The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument, because everyone immediately understood the problem. The board knew. That was different. Very different. The easiest explanation had disappeared. Residents could no longer tell themselves that management didn't know, or that somebody had misunderstood the law. The attorney's opinion had been placed directly in front of them, and the policy remained active. A few minutes later, Greg posted a message. Maybe they're betting nobody challenges it.
Nobody replied. Not immediately, because nobody wanted to admit the possibility. Then Patricia wrote, "That's actually worse." Several residents reacted instantly, because she was right. If the board genuinely misunderstood the law, that was one problem. If the board understood the risk and moved forward anyway, that was a completely different problem. The conversation became more serious. The jokes disappeared. Even moron #7inches stopped getting reactions. People began rereading the original email again, not searching for what it allowed, searching for what it meant. Mark opened the message for what felt like the 100th time. The words looked different now, not because the email had changed, because he had. The phrase that caught his attention wasn't gate access. It wasn't mail. It wasn't trash pickup. It was something he had barely noticed before. Effective immediately. He stared at the words, then reread them. Effective immediately. The policy wasn't coming. The policy wasn't proposed. The policy wasn't under review. It was already active. That realization spread through the chat almost instantly. One resident pointed it out, then another, then another. The conversation shifted again. For nearly 2 days, residents had been discussing future consequences. Now, they were discussing present ones. The board didn't need another meeting. The board didn't need another vote. According to the email, everything had already happened. Then, a resident named Brian posted something unexpected. "I just called the gate." The chat immediately stopped. "What? Why?" Brian replied, "Because I wanted to know if this was real." Nobody laughed. Nobody questioned it. At that point, everyone understood. The chat waited. Then, Mark asked the obvious question. "What did they say?" Brian's typing bubble appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, his answer arrived.
The guard already has a list. The chat exploded. "What list? Seriously? Names?" Brian replied. He didn't know anything about the attorney. Another message appeared. He only knew he had a list. The atmosphere changed instantly. The attorney's comment had felt important. This felt different. The attorney was a possibility. The list was real. Nobody knew whose names were on it. Nobody knew how often it was updated. Nobody even knew whether it would ever be used. But it existed. And that was enough. Because for the first time, residents could see the gap between the boardroom and the gate. The attorney was discussing statutes. The guard was following instructions. One dealt with legality, the other dealt with reality. Patricia finally asked the question nobody wanted to answer. What if somebody gets a violation notice this week? Nobody responded. Then Mark wrote, what if they already did?
The chat became quiet. Not because people lacked opinions, because everybody was thinking the same thing. The policy no longer felt hypothetical. Somewhere inside the neighborhood, somebody might already be affected by it. Somebody might already be wondering whether their transponder would work tomorrow, whether management considered them compliant, whether their name was already sitting on that list. The attorney's comment had created hope. For about an hour, it worked. Then the responses arrived. Then the list appeared. And hope started disappearing again. For almost an entire day, residents had been asking whether the board understood what it had approved. Now a different question was beginning to take shape. A much more uncomfortable question. What happens if the board knows exactly what it approved? Because if that was true, the biggest problem wasn't the policy itself. The biggest problem was that the system was already moving. The attorney had created doubt. The guard created something else. Reality. Because the list already existed. The policy was already active. And somewhere in the neighborhood, somebody's name might already be on it. The next morning felt strangely quiet. After 2 days of nonstop messages, arguments, screenshots, and speculation, the neighborhood chat had slowed down. People were working, driving, taking kids to school, trying to return to normal. For the first time since the email arrived, it felt possible that nothing else would happen. Maybe the board would reconsider, maybe management would send another email, maybe the entire situation would quietly disappear. Mark checked the chat around 8:30. Only 3 new messages. Nothing important. At 8:47, his phone vibrated, then vibrated again and again. The neighborhood chat had exploded. Mark opened it immediately. A resident named Jason had posted a message. Jason rarely participated. Most residents knew his name. Almost nobody knew anything else about him. His message was only one sentence. I think my name is on the list. The chat erupted instantly.
What list? The gate list? Are you serious?
Jason responded a minute later. My transponder didn't work. The chat stopped. For a moment, nobody knew what to say. Because this wasn't a theory anymore. This wasn't a discussion about future consequences. This had actually happened. Mark stared at the screen. Then another message appeared. I had to use the guard lane. Questions flooded the chat. When? This morning? What happened? Jason's typing bubble appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, he answered. The guard checked a printed list. The chat exploded. Several residents immediately asked the same question. The list from yesterday? Jason replied, I don't know, but he looked at a paper. Another resident jumped in. What happened after that? Jason answered. He made a phone call. That response somehow felt worse. Because now people could picture it. The guard, the booth, the printed list, the phone call. A process, not a mistake. A process.
Mark reread the messages. The attorney had talked about statutes, the residents had talked about policies, but none of that mattered much when a security guard was standing in front of a gate with a list of names. The chat continued moving. What did they tell him? Did they let you in? Were you denied? Jason finally answered. Eventually. The entire chat seemed to exhale. At least he got home. At least the gate opened. At least nobody had been locked out.
Then Jason posted another message, and the relief disappeared immediately. He said management would contact me. The chat exploded again. What for? Why? What violation? Jason's answer arrived quickly. I don't know. The chat slowed. That answer bothered people more than almost anything else. Not because Jason had violated a rule, because he didn't know whether he had. Residents began asking questions. Late dues? Unpaid fines? Architectural violation? Parking issue? Landscaping? Nobody knew. Then somebody asked the obvious question. Are you behind on dues? Jason replied almost immediately. No. Silence.
A few seconds later, another resident asked, "Current?" Jason answered, "Completely current." Nobody responded. Not immediately. 10 seconds. 20. 30. For almost a minute, the chat was silent because everyone was doing the exact same thing. Checking their own account, opening payment histories, reviewing balances, looking for anything they might have missed. The silence felt heavier than the panic, because panic meant people still thought they understood the problem. This was different. If Jason wasn't behind on payments, then everyone else's assumptions collapsed. The list wasn't just about unpaid dues, or at least nobody could prove that it was. The chat came back to life all at once. People started reviewing old notices, searching emails, checking account portals, trying to figure out what might have placed Jason on that list.
Jason couldn't provide an answer. Management hadn't contacted him. The guard hadn't explained anything. All he knew was that his transponder had stopped working. And somebody had his name on a piece of paper. Around mid-morning, Patricia posted a message. It was one of the shortest messages she'd written since the story began. This is exactly what I was afraid of. Nobody argued, because everyone understood what she meant. The problem wasn't that Jason got through the gate. The problem wasn't even the list. The problem was uncertainty. Nobody knew what triggered it. Nobody knew who maintained it. Nobody knew how names got added. Nobody knew how names got removed. And if Jason didn't know why he was on it, how could anyone else be sure they weren't next? Mark looked back at the original HOA email, then at Jason's messages, then back at the email. The attorney's comments suddenly felt far away. Not wrong, just far away. Because legal arguments happened on paper. The gate happened in real life. And right now, real life was winning. The chat continued for the rest of the morning. Residents comparing notices, checking balances, reviewing violation histories, looking for patterns. Nobody found one. By noon, the neighborhood had stopped asking whether the policy was legal. That question still mattered, but another question mattered more. A much more immediate question. Who decides whose name goes on the list? Because the gate had eventually opened for Jason. That wasn't the scary part. The scary part was that nobody could explain why it had closed in the first place. By the end of the week, the neighborhood chat looked completely different. The panic was gone, the arguments were gone. Even the endless debates about the gate had started to fade. Residents weren't sharing rumors anymore. They were sharing instructions. Mark noticed it almost immediately.
A few days earlier, every message had sounded the same. Can they do this? Is this legal? What happens next? Now, the questions were different. What should we save? Who should we call? What should we document? The shift happened gradually, then all at once. Jason's experience at the gate had changed something. The attorney's comment had changed something. The silence from management had changed something. Residents stopped waiting for answers. They started preparing for possibilities.
Dana posted first. She had signed up for informed delivery. A few days earlier, almost nobody in the neighborhood knew what it was. Now, dozens of residents were using it. Every morning, they received scans of the mail scheduled to arrive that day. Not because anything had happened, because they wanted a record if something did. The idea spread quickly. Screenshots started appearing in the chat. Delivery notices, tracking numbers, account balances, archived emails. People were saving everything. Brian posted next. He had spoken with someone at the local post office. Nothing dramatic, no investigation, no emergency, just a conversation. But the message caught everyone's attention. If anything happens to your mail, document it immediately. The chat reacted instantly. Residents started creating folders, saving screenshots, backing up emails, organizing records. For the first time all week, the neighborhood looked less like a group of worried homeowners and more like a group preparing evidence.
Patricia noticed it too. 3 days earlier, the HOA email had controlled the conversation. Now, the residents were controlling it. One homeowner saved every board email. Another downloaded payment histories. Another printed violation notices from previous years. Someone else created a timeline. The neighborhood had become its own archive. Mark watched it happen in real time. Nobody was talking about revenge. Nobody was talking about lawsuits. Not yet. They were talking about documentation, records, proof. The boring things. The things nobody cares about until they suddenly matter.
Then, somebody reposted part of the attorney's comment. Not the section about lawsuits, not the section about morons, a different section. The part about giving the board an opportunity to fix the problem. The chat became quiet because that felt different from everything else. For days, residents had imagined conflict. The attorney was talking about process, documentation, notice, evidence. Patricia finally replied, "That's why everybody is saving everything." Several residents reacted immediately because she was right. The goal wasn't to win an argument. The goal was to know exactly what happened and exactly when it happened.
The conversation continued throughout the afternoon. People compared notes, compared emails, compared timelines, compared experiences, and something unexpected happened. The fear started shrinking. Not because the policy disappeared, not because management changed course, not because anyone received an apology. The fear shrank because uncertainty shrank. Residents still didn't trust the policy, but they trusted their records. They trusted their screenshots. They trusted their documentation. And that changed everything.
Late that evening, Mark scrolled back through the chat. The first messages felt strange now. The panic, the confusion, the fear that nobody knew what to do. It felt like a completely different neighborhood. Because now, they did know what to do. Save the emails, document the notices, monitor the deliveries, track the communication, keep records. The policy was still active. The questions were still unresolved. The board still hadn't explained the list.
But the neighborhood wasn't waiting anymore. It was preparing.
The board had started the week with an email. The residents ended it with a file. Every screenshot, every notice, every delivery, every conversation, saved, organized, waiting. The board still had the policy. The board still had the gate. The board still had the authority to send emails. But by then, the neighborhood had something too. Records, timelines, documentation. And whether the policy survived or not, the residents would never look at another HOA email the exact same way again.